Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening. I'm Yvonne Stapp, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, we hear about our planet's most important natural system for absorbing CO2, which is the oceans, but within the oceans, microscopic organisms called phytoplankton periodically multiply in huge blooms that spread for miles across the oceans and can be observed actually from space satellites. The oceans themselves, and by means of the phytoplankton, absorb about 1/3 of the CO2 in our atmosphere. And for that reason, these blooms in our oceans play a fundamental role in maintaining the climate and the ecological health of the planet. Despite their importance, what triggers the blooms is very complex and not fully understood. One of the people instrumental to unraveling that mystery is Dr. Amala Mahadevan, a senior scientist in physical oceanography at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. She's also a fellow this year at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Dr. Mahadevan received her PhD from Stanford University, and she joined the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in 2011. Her research focus is the relationship between the physical and biological processes that shape the oceanic environment and contribute to Earth's climate. Dr. Mahadevan is engaged in an active research program with her collaborators, postdoctoral scientists, and PhD students in the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Joint Program. We are very pleased to be able to learn about the relationship between the ocean physics and the phytoplankton from a scientist who's contributed so much to this field of study. Start by asking you if you would please give us a little background about these ocean, how it works with the CO2 and then the role of the phytoplankton.
Okay, so I thought I'd start by demonstrating with this little video clip here, which is actually constructed from satellites. And so what you're looking at is the chlorophyll on the planet Earth. And you see the chlorophyll not only on the land masses, but you can see that the oceans contain a lot of chlorophyll. And this chlorophyll that you see in the oceans, of course, it's changing seasonally. So just as you have seasons on the land, the ocean chlorophyll increases during the summer months in most places, not always, but spring and summer, and then decreases at other times. And you also see a lot of variability in this chlorophyll. Some areas have a very high amount of chlorophyll, and other areas are more sparse in their chlorophyll. So this chlorophyll that you're looking at really comes from microscopic organisms, and those microscopic organisms are phytoplankton. They photosynthesize just like the plants on the planet Earth, except that they are free-floating, and they are called plankton because they are moved by the motions of the water. Some of them can swim, but many of them are sort of passively moved around by the currents of the water. And those organisms, just like land plants, they take up CO2. They take up CO2 that's dissolved in the oceans. Mm-hmm. And they give up oxygen during the daytime. Of course, they also, at night, they respire. And these organisms are then the primary producers in the food chain. So they are eaten by zooplankton, and zooplankton are eaten by fish and whales. And so all the life forms that we know in the ocean are dependent on these phytoplankton organisms, which essentially get their energy from sunlight. So they photosynthesize. Yeah.
So they're microscopic, basically. Yeah. Are they located in preferred areas in the oceans, or are they throughout?
So you find phytoplankton everywhere. You know, if you take a bucket of water anywhere in the oceans and you look under the microscope, it's rich in phytoplankton, and you'll see enormous diversity of these organisms. So we're just barely understanding even what's out there, and then there's a lot more to understand as to why they're there, who's there, when it's there, and all kinds of sort of things in their life cycle, their succession. The diversity is, as I said, is enormous also in size. You find an enormous range of size, 1,000, by a factor of 1,000 their size varies. So these organisms, as I said, they're free floating, they take up CO2, they respond to sunlight, so they need sunlight, and so when you ask me where they are in the oceans, they prefer to be in the surface ocean. They cannot grow in the absence of sunlight, the photosynthetic organisms, and they need nutrients. So just like land plants, they need nutrients. The primary nutrient is nitrate. So nitrate is the nitrate ion, and phosphate is another nutrient. Some of them need iron. Iron is a micronutrient, so they need it in small quantities. Then some of them need silica, and so they grow where they have an abundance of these nutrients. You'll find more of them.
Yeah, I have read, so I'm not sure whether it's correct, but that the North Atlantic, for some reason, is a favored place for, especially for the blooms. Maybe I should ask first, what are the blooms? So you say they're ubiquitous, they're all over the place, but what?
So bloom is hard to define, because if I were to ask you about your lawn, when does it bloom? In the spring it turns green, but there isn't a given day. And then if you wanted to define a day when it starts to bloom, you would have to set some sort of criteria. And so people do set some sort of criteria that, the biomass crosses some level, or the chlorophyll crosses some level, and we call it a bloom, or it starts to grow very fast, and that's what we call a bloom. In the subpolar ocean, so the North Atlantic, around 60 degrees north, you see an immense seasonal transition. And that seasonal transition, it's very low sunlight, north of 60 north in the winter. The surface mixed layer is deeply mixed, so you keep cooling the surface ocean. When you cool the surface ocean, you drive convection, because cold water is heavier than warmer water. It starts to sink. And so it gets mixed down to a depth of several hundred meters. And when that happens, if you're a little organism in the surface ocean, you just don't find enough light. But what's good is that by all this mixing, you get a lot of nutrients to come up in the winter. But the light isn't sufficient, because you hardly have sunlight. And if you're a phytoplankton being pushed down to 600 meters every now and then, every day, you just don't see enough light. So the sunlight decays with depth in the ocean. You get a lot of sunlight in the surface, and it decays exponentially with depth. So by the time you get 100 meters, there's very little light in the oceans. So these organisms just don't find enough light in the winter to grow. And when the spring comes, they start seeing enough light, and you see these sort of they break out into huge sort of blooms, because all the nutrients are there from the winter mixing.
Are the blooms, do they last for weeks, months, or whatever?
Yeah, weeks or months till they run out of nutrients. So now what happens is that there's plenty of light in the spring and summer, but the nutrients get consumed by the phytoplankton. And when they run out of nutrients, the oceans are very poorly mixed in the vertical, and it's very hard for them to bring those nutrients up when it's not cooling. When you start warming the oceans, then you create warm water at the surface, and that warm water stays trapped at the surface, because warm water is lighter than the cold water. And so, in fact, it doesn't mix in the summer very easily. And that, in fact, is an issue in many regions of the ocean. So if you look at further south, like south of, around 30 degrees north, for example, you have light all year round. But you don't have the mechanisms to bring the nutrients up. And so in those regions, the phytoplankton is limited by the availability of nutrients, which are lying deep below. And the upper layers, there's plenty of light. And so the question is, how do those nutrients come up? And that's where ocean physics plays a huge role.
That's exactly the thing, because that's the part we never hear about for sure. So we might see pictures of
So I can show you a little example of this layering of the ocean by using a little tank to do an experiment. And you'll be surprised at how just using salt. So the reason the ocean is layered is because it's layered because of salinity and temperature. So salty water is heavier than fresh water. The oceans are salty, but the salt content varies. And they're also temperature stratified. Cold water tends to sink, warm water tends to rise. So unlike the atmosphere, you heat it from below. And so when you heat it, the warm air rises. And so the atmosphere is convecting all the time. Whereas the oceans, for a large part of the time, you're heating them from above. And so the tropical oceans, for example, are heated from above. The water warms, but it doesn't sink because it's warm. So I want to show you a little bit this experiment of creating a stratified ocean. And by stratified, I really mean it's layered in density. And that's how the oceans are.
So all we need is some salt water. Is that the idea?
That's right, but we're going to create a layering of salt. So I have this tank, and it's got this partition in the middle. And I want to create something like a demo ocean. So I'm going to put salt on one side of the tank.
Okay, just add salt.
Okay, so what happens when I add salt, as you might imagine, I'm going to make this side of the water more dense.
Okay. Right? Do you want me to stir or something?
That's okay. And I'm going to add some color so you can see it. And then I'm going to just open this partition. So it's going to create a layered fluid in which, the salty water is heavier, so it's going to sink below the fresh water. And that's in fact...
So it's going to sink below that other side, the other side doesn't have salt.
That's right.
Oh, isn't that clever?
Okay. And so...
Can you all see?
And you can see that the water that's saltier kind of stays at the bottom. In the oceans, it would be both salt and temperature that creates this. And in fact, you're generating these waves, which are at the interface of both fluids.
Yes.
So the ocean is layered, and there are waves at the surface. There are waves at the interface of these different layers. Those are called internal waves, just like you have surface waves. When those waves break or get sort of energized, then you get some sort of mixing. But one of the big problems, or I shouldn't say the problems, one of the things that we find about the ocean is that the oceans are forced at the surface. So the oceans are in motion because the wind is blowing at the surface. And that wind blowing at the surface sets up a lot of currents. And those currents are all getting their energy from the surface, from the wind, or even if you heat the ocean, it's at the surface. But the ocean is very strongly layered, and that layering prevents things from mixing vertically. I'll show you a little bit further that I've just did this with 2 layers, but you can imagine that if I now put something in here and mix it, maybe it's a little less intuitive for you to think what will happen to this layer of water.
But now in the ocean, it's all salty. It's uniformly salty.
No, it's not uniformly salty. So this is the thing. It's layered. Okay. It's very, very layered. So denser water, the water doesn't care whether it's salt or temperature, but denser water tends to want to be below. And so now I've created a water by stirring these 2 kinds of waters.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to ask you to think about what will happen when I open this. Right? And so when I open this, it's going to try to find its own density at which it's comfortable. And so you created water really of another density, and that other density is intermediate to those densities, because I had a lighter water on top, a heavier water below, and then I mixed them and I created a water of intermediate density. And that intermediate water is now flowing across. So this is in fact what happens in the oceans. You create waters of different densities if they're cooled or if they become salty or fresh at the surface. And those different waters of different densities seem to interleave and form these layers. And I can show you that, in an image of what it looks like, the ocean, when you make some measurements. I'd like you to just look at this graphic of the ocean here, and what you're looking at is a section, a vertical section slice taken through the ocean. And so this is temperature, and you can see that the red colors means that it's warmer, the blue colors means it's denser, and we are looking at the upper 200 meters in this case of the ocean. This is the Indian Ocean, in fact. And you can see that the warm waters at the top, the colder waters lying below, and those black lines are contours of density. So the ocean is sort of very layered like a cake. And then the wind blows at the surface and it mixes the upper layers, and that upper layer of the ocean is called the mixed layer, but it's very hard to bring the nutrients up from below. So what I wanted to really show you by creating these layers is that now if you are phytoplankton, you want to live in the surface where there's light, but all the nutrients are used up at the surface because there's light there, and the nutrients are below. And the problem is, how do phytoplankton get both nutrients and light? So that's where the ocean physics comes in, because the physics either helps to move things up or down, bring the nutrients up in one case, or in another case, in the winter, so this is the situation with the blooms, you have these very deep surface mixed layers, nutrients are mixed up, but the phytoplankton is being sent down to great depths of 500 meters. So they want to actually remain in the surface layer where they can get more light. And in that case, you want to create this layering to start the bloom.
Okay. So this is the stuff that you have worked on, what triggers the blooms. Right. Okay.
So what we found is, so firstly I want to say is that the oceans are complex. There isn't a one mechanism that does it all.
Right.
And although we found one mechanism, that mechanism plays out, we think, at certain times, and we think it's very widely prevalent. We measured it or saw evidence of it in one place in the North Atlantic. A lot more work needs to be done to figure out, is that mechanism prevalent in other places? There are other mechanisms that people have proposed, and those too are active. Right. And so it's a question of trying to decide in what regime. So there's a sort of whole fabric of complex processes, and I can tell you about one piece
First,
of it.
If we can just get clear now, this is the trigger for the bloom.
That's right.
What makes them bloom and clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll tell it to you as it occurred for us, maybe, and that's helpful. So I have some colleagues who make measurements in the North Atlantic Ocean, and they wanted to capture the onset of the bloom to understand the triggers for this North Atlantic spring bloom. As I said, the spring bloom is important, especially in the North Atlantic, because the North Atlantic is a region that takes up a lot of carbon dioxide, and the phytoplankton certainly play a role in that. Okay, so they put these autonomous instruments. That's a sea glider that you're seeing in the image there. It's a little robotic instrument about that size, and it's really like a glider airplane. It's got some batteries, yes, by which it adjusts the angles of its wings. And this robotic glider, it makes a dive, and then at certain depth it's told to come back up, and so it adjusts the angle of the wings. It comes back up and goes down, comes back up, and when it comes up, it transmits its data to a satellite.
How clever.
Yeah. So we have these sorts of instruments, and then there's another instrument which is a float, and it's sort of going around, and these gliders are sort of following this and trying to follow a patch of water in which we wanted to observe, my colleagues wanted to observe how the phytoplankton grows.
Okay, so first they determine what they're going to look at, and they're talking about, we would say, miles or kilometers, right? Just a huge, vast difference. Run out there, sink your little robot, and get
and
this
ships
data.
have to go out there, get the data.
Yeah.
Then they have to calibrate the data, so they have to make bottle samples, make all kinds of measurements, sort of day and night. So ships' operations are very intensive, and they put some robotic instruments out there to help make those measurements autonomously, because you can leave the instruments out for a long time. And
they're measuring like the amount of phytoplankton?
Yeah, so they measure. So these instruments, they typically measure the temperature and salinity. They give us the stratification of the oceans. They can measure currents in some approximate way, although you can measure currents from the ship very well, the velocities of the water. They can measure chlorophyll fluorescence, or phytoplankton fluorescence, so they fluoresce. And from that you can back out the chlorophyll. They can measure something called backscatter. So when you shine light on them, they scatter the particles. And so you can tell that there are particles in the water or there are phytoplankton.
Okay.
So these are the sorts of measurements. Oxygen they can measure, and the nitrate, they put some instruments on them to measure.
So they go out, they get all this great stuff.
And so they found something unusual. So the general understanding for the onset of the bloom is that, as I said, there's surface is cooling, everything's being mixed very deep, and phytoplankton don't see enough light because they're being pushed to depths of several hundred meters. And what they're waiting for is some form of layering to set in. And when that layering sets in, then the phytoplankton get trapped in a surface layer, and then on average they can see more light during the day.
Right.
So the understanding had always been that when spring comes, the sun comes out, it starts to warm the surface ocean, and when you warm the surface ocean, you create a warm layer on top, and that's where phytoplankton get trapped, and then they start to bloom because now they are near the surface. They already had nutrients and they get sunlight. But what they noticed there in this experiment in the North Atlantic is that the bloom started after the water column had become layered, but before the sun was really warming the surface. So the oceans were still being cooled because there was a strong wind and strong loss of heat from the surface, but they saw that the ocean started to layer up. And so the question was, why did it start to layer? And once it started to layer, then they saw that this phytoplankton started to grow because it was now trapped in the near surface layer. So what we had been doing at that time is that we had been looking at physical mechanisms by which you can generate a layering in the surface ocean.
I see.
And the very obvious mechanism, of course, is that you warm the surface and the warm water gets trapped. And that you may think of as a one-dimensional process, right? So you heat the water on top and you have a water column and it does this. But what we found is that, in fact, this is a very three-dimensional process. So if I create water of different densities, and in fact in the North Atlantic we have this situation. You have cold water and you have warmer water. These waters are in fact side by side.
Side by side, not on top. One on top.
But not exactly stacked up like that. If you think about the northern, the poles, the water is colder. As you come equator, the water is warmer. And the reason that you can have this in the ocean where you have warmer water next to colder water is because the earth is spinning. And because the earth is spinning, the flow in the ocean occurs along the lines or the contours of pressure. So you can think that if you have warm water, cold water, then the pressure contours are in this direction, but the flow occurs in that direction too, so it's not occurring across the contours of pressure. In a tank at home, if I tilt the tank, then I have higher pressure here, lower pressure, and the water is going to flow in the direction of the pressure gradient. In the ocean, if I have higher pressure and lower pressure, then the flow is going to be, in fact, in that direction.
Because the earth is spinning.
Because the earth is spinning. And so the pressure gradient force is balanced by the spinning of the earth, a Coriolis force. And so because of that, you can have, when you have differences between warm water and cold water, the flow is in the direction of those temperature contours or those density contours. So that prevents these waters from sort of completely mixing. But at the same time, the flow, when it's starting to go in this direction, it starts to wiggle. And when it starts to wiggle, it's called an instability. It forms eddies, and I'm going to show you a movie of these eddies. As you'll see in a global ocean, the ocean is filled with eddies and currents. And these eddies, when they start to spin, they allow the warm water or the light water to be spread over the denser water. And so what you do is you start with an ocean in which the contours or surfaces of density are vertical. Then you form eddies. And these eddies take the warm water and squish it or swirl it over the cold water, and the cold water slides below. So the eddies allow you to relayer. What that does is it creates a layering, and now plankton are stuck in this layer, and when they're stuck in that layer, then they can essentially see more sunlight over the course of the day and bloom.
Yeah,
Right.
I'd just like to insert there, and again, that they can't swim. in
Yeah,
general.
most of
so
these
they're
life forms,
passive
that's
for
right.
the most
Yeah,
part, so they
yeah.
really depend on
Yeah.
the ocean, the physics of the oceans to put them
That's right.
where they're where they
Yeah.
want to go.
Yeah.
Okay, great. You're going to show us the
So
eddies?
I wanted to show you, a picture of the global ocean, and the global ocean is filled with a whole multitude of scales of eddies. And so you can see that there are strong currents. What you're looking at here, the white tells you where the currents are. In fact, it's the magnitude of the velocity that's been plotted in white. And you can see that the ocean is full of these sort of meandering currents. They never flow straight. They become very unstable, and so they're wiggling around. And when they wiggle around, they form all these swirling motions.
Yeah.
And any swirling motion we call, an eddying motion.
Yeah.
And this eddying motion is what
Really
allows,
are.
So the Southern Ocean is very, very energetic, full of full of eddies and full of
Right.
energy. Okay, so these energetic sort of motions in the ocean allow you to rearrange the density and create that layering, and that's what triggers the
Right.
bloom.
That's really interesting. But is there any preferred location? Are they closer to the coast or to the mid oceans? It doesn't matter. They're just everywhere.
Yeah, so the eddies occur everywhere.
Okay.
But we have certainly currents which are set up the way they are because of certain boundaries. I was lucky to find an image on the NASA website today which shows you a piece of the ocean. This is
Yeah.
the South China Sea that you can see, and it's seen from the Aquamodis instrument satellite, and it's a shot from it's a picture from today, and you can see how beautiful these eddies leave their signature in the surface chlorophyll. So what you see being stirred around by the eddies is the surface chlorophyll.
Is the green the chlorophyll
That's right.
the action,
Right,
their
exactly,
stimulation?
yeah.
Okay, all right. So, well, now we know, we've got to this part then, that it is these eddies. Let me ask you here very quickly, is this something new that you've been able to do? It sounds like your equipment, for one thing, just the
Yeah.
equipment, not the computer models yet, but just the equipment is very sophisticated. And it sounded from what I read that you have numerous boats, and it's very well coordinated. Could you have done this like 15 years ago? Or
No,
it's new.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's new is several things are new. One is our capability of measurements.
Okay.
And so there is a lot of robotic instruments. My colleagues make these robots and deploy these robots, these sea gliders and floats to make these measurements, and you're able to make measurements at very high intensity. You're able to have multiple robots going into the ocean, making dives, watching what's happening. So we're able to piece together what's happening at much higher resolution in space and time. So with time, our understanding of the oceans has increased. Previously, our measurements were very sparse. Even now, they're sparse compared to the size of
Big
the oceans.
yeah.
But we can go in and observe a
Yeah.
piece of the ocean at fairly well with multiple instruments. Again, it's expensive, and depending on how much money we put into it,
Exactly, but I'm sure this will generate a great deal of interest.
Yeah.
But after they get the data, and it sounds like mountains of data,
Right.
possibly, then they go back to the lab, and you developed some computer modeling
That's
for this.
right.
Can you tell us
Yeah.
about that, how you do
Yeah,
this?
so the data is always going to be sparse, and that's because you may measure a profile in the ocean in time, but you don't have a full three-dimensional picture of how things
I
are
see.
evolving in space and time. And that's where I develop models to try and give us a picture of what is happening. And in the model, we don't have just one observation or one sample or one. So imagine that you want to look at this table and your eyes are closed, but you're able to take one spot here, one spot
Yeah.
here, and things are changing in the ocean all the time. And you make an observation.
Very dynamic, yeah.
Now you want to piece it all together and understand what processes are leading to those observations that you make. And that's where sort of my specialization comes in. I develop the models which are solving equations. So, people who who do math know that these are partial differential equations. You put them in a computer, you discretize them, and they are very much like our weather models today, the models for the ocean. We solve these equations, we integrate them forward in time, and we are able to see how these ocean eddies are evolving and how they change one state of the ocean into another state. So what we did is we took a state of the ocean that was observed by these robots or these gliders. We put it in the model, an approximate state. Again, we don't have an exact state. And we run the model forward in time and we see it evolve. And then we keep comparing with the observations that we had later in time. And these observations didn't capture the evolution of the eddies or didn't show what's happening. But now we can say, oh, look, that's what we saw there. And it's probably due to an eddy doing that. Right.
So you then can sort of predict, and then it's like a hypothesis, you then correct when you get more data as you accumulate data and so on. So these models are indispensable in the long run today. We hear about models all the time.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can do much more if you piece these things all together.
Exactly.
So
well,
they
I was just thinking the data are so complex that's the thing. What do you project in the future here now in terms of your project for developing this more?
So, so here we looked at the beginning of the bloom, what brings about the bloom. Another very important piece of the puzzle is what happens to all this plankton that's produced in the surface. So what happens in the ocean is that you produce all this organic matter, which is now particulate organic matter, and it may be eaten by zooplankton. The zooplankton produce fecal pellets. They have all these body parts of theirs, and all these things are now sinking very gradually out of the ocean. They get attacked by bacteria, and they get the dissolved nitrate and carbon is re-released into the ocean. But some of these little particles, they sink way down deep, very deep. And that process is what helps to take carbon from the surface ocean and sequester it very deep. Okay. A very small percentage, maybe 1%, may get to the bottom of the ocean. But that's our burial rate of carbon. Okay. And that's what really leads to the deposits of carbon. Now, of course, we're taking it out very fast when we use fossil fuels. But over millions and millions of years, these carbon deposits got buried, not just in the open ocean, but everywhere in marshes or bogs or forests. And that's what produced our fossil fuels. So we are interested in also thinking about what fraction of what's produced at the surface gets very deep and how it gets down. Okay. Yeah.
So have you done that part yet, or that's the part that's coming
a little bit has been done in this. As part of this experiment, they were able to observe the sinking of these diatoms, which were the beginning of the bloom. At some particular point in the bloom, they ran out of silica, these diatoms. They need them for making little frustules or shells. And then they formed cysts and they just sank. It was sort of their response to running out of. And so that part was sort of captured by some of these robotic instruments because they were able to see a plume of these particles sinking. But we'd like to find better the connection between what you see in the surface and how much sinks out and when it sinks out and how it sinks out by actually going in to look at the export part of this in more detail.
Can I go back for the carbon itself, for the CO2, rather very quickly here? Now that we have pumped so much CO2 and it keeps increasing, it doesn't have any place to go, and in addition, warming in the ocean, does this kind of change this process? Do you think?
So we've put out a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's higher than we've known, probably millions of years. Certainly we have a very clean record for the last 650,000 years, and it's much higher. And it's not as high as it would have been without the oceans. The oceans have already taken up about a quarter or a third of it. Terrestrial plants have taken out a quarter or a third, and the remaining part in the atmosphere. And what happens is that all the CO2 that got dissolved in the ocean, it gets dissociated, and you get a hydrogen ion, which creates, which actually lowers the pH of the oceans. The oceans are alkaline. They have a pH of about 8.2, but that pH is now coming down gradually, and we can see that and observe that. The concern is that many of the phytoplankton and many marine organisms rely on forming calcium carbonate shells. So coccolithophores, for example, form little tiny shells of calcium carbonate. And to secrete those shells, they need the right pH conditions.
Yeah.
So if the pH is reduced, made a little less alkaline,
Right.
it's not yet acidic, but a little less
Right.
alkaline, then what would happen is that prevents them from secreting these calcium carbonate shells. And so the big concern is that if the organisms cannot form their little calcium carbonate shells, then they may not be as good at sinking. And so we would change what's called this biological pump, which is taking carbon from the surface and putting it down below. Now, it's a little too early for us to make some sort of conclusive statements about this yet, because there's a lot to be understood in terms of what the acidification is doing, what are the adaptations, or what are the sort of changes that might happen in the community and the species. There are so many species of phytoplankton, so when one stops being produced as much, the niche may be taken over by another species. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen to the ecosystem. But certainly we see big changes in the ocean.
Yes.
And if you think about all the changes that we see, in terms of CO2 or in terms of temperature, the oceans, when you say global warming, it's a little bit of a misnomer because we say, oh, it's so cold today and where's the warming?
Right.
But
at least here, right.
But 97% of that heat is in the oceans because the oceans have, specific heat capacity, which is much more than the atmosphere. And so you see that all that is in the oceans. And similarly, the CO2, you see a lot of it in the oceans.
Yes.
So this is one of our sort of concerns as to about the oceans.
But all of these kinds of dynamics then change a lot of the other work that you are doing, right? In terms of understanding the physics and
that's
everything.
Right. Yes. These things are all coupled.
The physics, everything that goes together in a package.
When you warm the surface ocean, you stratify it more. It makes it harder for nutrients to come up. So what does that do? So when you get rid of sea ice, for example, the Arctic is now ice-free. For a longer period of every year. The summer months, there's a lot of regions which are ice-free, so the summer ice has really declined. What does that do? It's now exposing the Arctic to winds, which was never exposed to before, also to sunlight. Will you have more blooms, less blooms? These are things that people are very interested in trying to understand or study.
It sounds as though you will be busy for quite a while, but it's very interesting, very admirable work. And at this point, I'd like to talk some more, but we have a lot of students in here tonight, and I think they'd like to talk with you as well.
Sure.
So I will stop here, and so that they can do some questions and answers. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Then would you, if you can reproduce those blooms artificially, then could you use that as a way to sort of fight climate change and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Okay, so there's been some attempt for people to say that they can initiate a bloom. First of all, the oceans are immense and vast, and the most we could do is try to initiate a bloom in a small way somewhere. And the place in which this has been really tried out is the Southern Ocean. And the reason is that in the Southern Ocean, the one thing that is most limiting the phytoplankton is iron. So they are iron limited in the Southern Ocean. And there have been a few experiments where people have gone with a ship and dumped iron dust in the ocean, and in response they see the growth of phytoplankton. But there was really very difficult for them to prove or show that this phytoplankton, this organic matter that's produced, actually made it deep into the ocean, and how long this carbon will be sequestered, because you may produce phytoplankton, but not all that phytoplankton is actually making it deep down. So it starts to sink, but the bacteria sort of act on it, and it releases its nutrients again and produce dissolved carbon. And that dissolved carbon may just come back up. So we don't know whether we can successfully use phytoplankton to sequester carbon. Certainly on a large scale, we don't think, and those experiments haven't led to any successful. But also it could change the ecosystem. So when you do an experiment like that, there is a concern that you may now bring in different species of organisms and change the ecosystem.
Does the magnetic field of the Earth play a role into this, especially when the salinity of the water and all the currents and stuff like that?
Not that we know of.
What makes a bloom toxic?
Okay, so there's certain species of phytoplankton produce toxins, and so they're called harmful algal blooms. They are specific species, and it's called a red tide sometimes is a common name for it. That's one way in which it can be toxic. There are some species that produce spines, and these spines can sort of inflict damage on other organisms that ingest them. Those are the sort of common reasons for. But I think in some places it's thought that an excess of nitrate or fertilizer that comes off the land can trigger some of these harmful algal blooms. People have tried to correlate them with nitrate coming off the land from agricultural waste.
Have the algae been studied long enough to correlate the total amount of algae in the ocean to the change in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
No, there isn't a no, I would say no, because there's a lot of other things that also can change them. So trying to correlate with one factor is difficult.
Now with climate change, have you seen any changes in blooms, like as in frequency in blooms or how long they take to bloom? Or?
Yeah, so certainly one place where that's most I would say likely to occur and where it is seen to occur is the Arctic. But sometimes we lack observations for long, so there's a lot of variability, and so most people will say that when you see 2 or 3 years of data, it's difficult to say is it climate change or is it so there's a lot of variability in the ocean. One year you may have a warmer Gulf of Maine, another year you may have a cooler Gulf of Maine, and so they certainly see relationships between temperature, sunlight, sea ice and the blooms. Whether these are all anthropogenic effects is difficult to say for certain. One place in which you can say it with more certainty is the Arctic because of the sea ice receding so significantly.
And my other question is, how long have these studies been done on blooms, and has it been long enough to really conclude significant data from that?
Yeah, so people have been interested in blooms for more than 50 years. In the 50s itself, people were looking at, what starts a bloom or what causes a bloom. One of the most, there's a scientist called Sverdrup, for example, who came up with the first theory of why you start a bloom by stratifying the ocean. Is there sufficient data? For there to be sufficient, the observations were very sparse initially. Now we have better observations, but again, the observations that are made in the ocean are still sparse. Satellite observations certainly help us to fill in the thing. So, with 10 or 12 years of satellite chlorophyll data, we can go in and look at some region of the ocean and say that, we see the blooms occurring earlier or later, or their intensity is more. So certainly we can create those sorts of analysis now from satellite, but not for 50 years, only the last tens of years. Yeah.
Are there any harmful effects of having too many blooms in the ocean? Because we've been only talking about the benefits, and I was just wondering.
Yeah, so in many regions, if there's, and the Gulf of Mexico is one region where the blooms are so immense and that they are stimulated by nitrate that comes out in the Mississippi River because of agricultural runoff, then the blooms become so large that when that organic matter starts to sink, it becomes a huge sink for oxygen, because that organic matter is now going to decay by bacteria acting on it, and when it starts to decay, it takes up oxygen, and that creates anoxia or hypoxia, conditions of low oxygen in the subsurface water. So sinking organic matter decaying creates hypoxia and a higher demand for oxygen. And that can be harmful to fish, for example. In coastal regions, when you get hypoxia, it's a big problem. Thank you. Thank you.